Hello everyone, and welcome to my tutorial on how to make Breath of the Wild Sheikah Slate. A lot of people commented on my TikTok tutorial that you would like to see a full detailed walkthrough on how to make it, so here I am making a second Sheikah Slate just so I can show you how I did it. Don't worry though, I honestly don't mind having a second one of these lying around, and truthfully I think I did a much better job on round 2. So first what I did was print out a picture of the Sheikah Slate so that the picture is the same size as I wanted it to be in 3 dimensions. Next, once I had printed a picture of the slate, I cut out the picture and glued it down to a piece of wood that's about 1 inch thick. From there, I sawed the wood in a rectangle to be the same size as the printed picture, disregarding for now the finer details of the shape. Please, for goodness sake, take every precaution possible when woodworking. This is definitely the most dangerous part of the project, and it would really suck to get injured. Once I have my rectangle of wood cut out, I go to find a drill bit that's the same size of the handle on the slate. Just hold up the bit to the printed picture to make sure the size checks out. From there, I use a drill press to make 2 holes on either side of the handle. Next, I use a jigsaw to cut in 2 straight lines connecting the holes, thus making a sort of oval-shaped hole on one end of the wood. I also cut out this curvy shape at the other end of the wood. I unfortunately lost the footage of doing that, but the process is essentially the same. I find this next part kind of fun actually, but you still have to be careful. I use a belt sander to sand down all the corners of the slate, flattening the pointed edges on it. The next step I took was to draw out where I was going to make a cavity to put the screen. Please ignore how embarrassingly long it took me to just be able to draw a rectangle for this part. Anyways, I then used a Dremel to carve out the rectangular shape. It ended up being pretty messy, but it doesn't really matter since we'll be putting the screen there anyways. Make sure to keep everything relatively shallow since the screen needs to be flush with the rest of the wood. Thankfully, this was the final step in the woodworking process, so for me at least, most of the scary stuff is over with. Before putting clay down, I made sure to dry the wood in the oven at about 200 degrees Fahrenheit in a couple of 10-minute increments. Be sure to keep an eye on the wood in the oven so nothing goes wrong while you're gone. Before I begin sculpting, I sketch out the Sheikah symbol on the other side of the wood, making sure to heavily reference. After some experimentation, I found out that mixing wood glue with Sculpey Bacon Bond made for a really powerful adhesive to stick the clay to the wood. If you use this mixture, however, be sure to work fast since the wood glue likes to dry quickly. After laying down the glue, I stuck a rough shape of clay over it and began sculpting the Sheikah symbol over my sketch. This whole sculpting process took quite a while, so just be patient with your materials. Make sure to save your sculpting progress every once in a while by baking the slate in the oven according to the polymer clay instructions. Before baking the slate, I would gently paint acetone nail polish remover over the clay to get rid of dust and fingerprints. However, if you do this, make sure to let the nail polish remover dry completely since number 1, acetone is extremely flammable and is a bad idea to have in the oven, and number 2 will cause your clay to crack and crumble in the oven. As you can see, this in combination with baking the slate too frequently caused some parts of my sculpting to crumble. It was a quick fix though, with a smooth coating of Bake and Bond and some more time in the oven. I realized I had forgotten this little detail on the slate after baking it, so I very carefully carved it out with some clay tools after it had hardened. I ended up having to use purple clay for the handle since I ran out of gray, but this isn't a big deal since I painted over everything anyways. My next step was to sand everything down very carefully with a fine grit sandpaper, making sure not to lose any woodworking or sculpting detail. This step is just to make sure that the paint really sticks to everything. My first layer of paint was just plain white acrylic to give myself an evenly colored base to work off of. Also, absolutely never use spray paint. As easy as it may seem to just coat the whole project, spray paint reacts very poorly with polymer clay and it will never dry. I made this mistake the first time I made a slate, and I had to spend literal hours scrubbing sticky spray paint off the clay with pure acetone, so please use acrylic. Next, using references of the slate, I mixed a brown color and painted the appropriate parts of the slate with it. After it had sufficiently dried, I dry brushed a lighter brown over all of the edges for added detail and a slight appearance of wear. I continued painting the raised details of the slate with a light beige, repeating the same dry brushing process to make the slate look more like an old stone artifact. After this, I proceeded to paint the blue circle on the front of the slate. I traced a paint cap in the center of the eye to make sure I had as close to a perfect circle as I could. Then, with a darker blue, I painted a ring around the outer portion of the circle. From there, I moved on to painting the orange details on the slate, being especially careful around the handle. As I did with the blue, I used a more vibrant orange to paint the finer details. After finishing these, I made a rather precarious setup and sprayed a matte finish over all of my painting. At this point, the clay parts of the slate should be fully covered by acrylic paint, so any exposure to spray finish should have no effect on it. While allowing the slate to dry, I moved on to making the screen. Firstly, I printed out the mirror image of the Sheikah symbol and taped it to what would end up being the front of the screen, so when I finished painting the symbol and flipped it around, it would be facing the right way. Then, I mixed a fair amount of light blue glow-in-the-dark powder with Mod Podge and painted the symbol as well as the borders of the plastic. I also made sure to paint on several layers of Mod Podge so the symbol would be clear and the glow would be bright. While allowing the Mod Podge to dry, I moved on to sculpting the pieces surrounding the slate screen. For the thin, curly parts, I used an extruder to make long worms of clay that were consistently sized. After allowing each part to bake, I painted them with the same beige as the other parts of the slate. Then I dry brushed a lighter brown over it and painted the details in the same blue that I used before. Once the Mod Podge on the screen had dried, I painted on several layers of black acrylic to make sure there were no streaks or thin patches. These final steps are a bit tricky, so it's important to pay attention to what you're doing. In order to make certain areas of the slate glow, I mixed UV resin with glow-in-the-dark powder. The first color I used was blue, so I poured out the resin bit by bit to the blue part of the slate in the middle of the eye. Be mindful that resin can be quite runny and tends to flow where you don't want it, so go slow and be careful. Once I was happy with where I had the resin, I very carefully used a lighter to get rid of any bubbles. Once I had them all popped, I cured the resin under a UV light for several minutes. I'm not entirely aware of the science behind it, but if I were to guess, I would say that adding the glow powder makes the resin more opaque, making it take more time to cure, so be aware of this and be prepared to cure the resin for long periods of time to ensure that it doesn't end up being sticky. Then I repeated the process of filling in resin, popping bubbles, and curing it under a lamp for each glowing part of the slate, both blue and orange. Also, be sure to keep whatever container you use to store your resin mixture out of the way while curing the slate. I made the mistake of leaving mine too close to the light and had to remix my resin embarrassingly frequently. When working with resin, be prepared to work at a lot of odd angles, have patience during curing, and work in a well-ventilated area at all times. As you can see, I chose to put the screen in off camera. I forgot to compensate for the bulk of paint on the materials, so it took a lot of finessing. However, I did manage to fit it in and glued it down with hot glue. After that, I used super glue to stick down the screen details. Finally, my very last step was to paint on tiny beige filaments over the top and bottom of the screen, with as thin a line as I could manage. And with that, the Sheikah slate is finished. This project took several years off of my life probably, but it was so worth it in the end. It turned out so much better than my last one, and I would like to think that it is about as accurate as I could get to the one featured in the game. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.